really anything you would want people to know right off the bat about you before we get into the book?
Um, I think the thing that people really should know is that I tend to be I'm conservative in regard to conspiracy. Yeah,
Okay.
I do follow tracks of conspiracy. The conspiracies I deal with, I found to be relatively, they're small conspiracies. They're not gigantic deep state conspiracies. So I do, I've written about several conspiracies. I mean, I've written about conspiracies in regard to MLK, JFK, RFK. So I do write I certainly accept the possibility, or accept the, not just possibility, accept that there were conspiracies involved in all of these, but they're not the same one, and it's not a repeat. It's situational, So people, I'm certainly not a lone nut. I definitely Oswald didn't do it. Nope, not even close. Not even. But I'm probably more conservative than a lot of people that tend to focus on large scale conspiracies all over the place.
Right on.
And maybe that, so I don't, that might help people, when they look at my work, they're going to see when I write about MLK, RFK, JFK, they're different conspiracies. So,
I mean, I hate to ask you this, but do you think that it's still under the same umbrella group,
no,
if you will?
no,
Do you think they're all completely separate,
different
if you will?
sponsors, different motives. A lot of it is very, and when I say situational, I mean, obviously there are tons of motives when you enter the political arena. And
Right.
it's not that, for example, just for reference, did the ultra right have plans in place? Were they preparing to attack JFK? Absolutely, they were. That doesn't mean, and the ultra right did attack MLK Jr., but that
Right.
doesn't mean it was connected. Uh, Radicals who did involve in conspiracy have their own motives that are driving them. Even sometimes, like they may both talk. Like we have people that talked about setting up rifle teams to kill JFK, but they weren't the ones that you've got to focus on who actually did it, not who
Right.
talked about it, not
Right.
who made the threats. Always lots of threats floating around. In RFK Jr., the first thing the mayor of Los Angeles did is the communists kill him. Without pausing for 30 seconds. It was like the mayor goes on the air and the communists killed him. It's like, no, that's not the way to approach these things. Don't
Right.
just roll out your standard This is not one of these the usual suspects things. Let's actually investigate this.
I hear you. Um, so like, I guess the book is Oswald, or just Oswald puzzle, reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald, and that launches January 14th, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, should be available by January 14th for sure. They've already done the print run. It just depends on how soon Amazon can stock it. Uh,
Okay, is that where you suggest people to get it from?
Not now. If you wanted it now, and
Okay.
now, and to be sure you got it as early as you could get, it's available for pre-order on Amazon. But it will be available through bookstores. Will be in distribution. Obviously, it's going to be available in Kindle on
Okay.
Amazon. So if you want it in Kindle, that's the place to get it. But it will be Skyhorse is a major publisher, so it will, bookstores will stock it or can order it. You can get it. And what I have found, quite frankly, with all of my books, within probably about a month, it'll be available on eBay
Okay.
because eBay, there are like several booksellers on eBay that stock it out of distribution. So it doesn't have to age like for 3 or 5 years before it shows up on eBay. I'm always amazed. It's like, wait a minute, it's on eBay with 10 resellers and it just shipped last week.
Right on. Uh, do you have your own website that you will provide it on through?
I'd have my own website, but really I don't focus this on the website anymore. The website is larry-hancock.com.
Okay.
Uh, and it has a lot of information on my earlier books, but I've been doing this for so long that when I started out, the website was important to actually put documents on.
Right
and
on.
put reference material on, and that's passed. I mean, the book, the Oswald puzzle has over 400 endnotes, and almost all of them have links to sites on the internet where you can look at the document itself or the source itself. So I really haven't been focusing on the website for some time. It's there. If you got one of my older books, you would find it and find, reference material. The first book I ever wrote on the Kennedy assassination, Someone Who Was Talked, is on there with a lot of chapter by chapter reference materials, documents, photos, but I don't really do that anymore because the internet has evolved.
Right on. It's kind of gone to the video, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, so I guess first question I would probably ask is why you decided to write this book, and maybe what angles you were looking at it from.
Yeah. Yeah. This book, I really, I've written so much about the Kennedy assassination and researched it and presented on it at conferences and that sort of thing for decades. I finally came to the point with my last book on Tipping Point. Tipping Point was really a book on what I believe was the origin of the actual conspiracy, the people involved in the attack in Dallas, how it evolved and came about, and a lot about the tactical detail of how the attack was carried out. Once I finished that book, it's sort of like, well, okay, after 30 some years, I'm satisfied. I've satisfied myself at least. Okay, I think I know what happened. I've written about it. I've done my duty, right? After 3 decades, I figured that's enough. But in this instance, I began to wonder. It's sort of like the one thing I hadn't written about in any great detail was Oswald himself. And when I had written about him, especially in the early days, I had pretty much just assumed that the people that had been into the books and the studies, I assumed that what I was reading was right. It sounded right. That, citing authority is always good. Okay, these people must know what they're talking about. But especially with the new information that's emerged over the last decade, the last 10, 15 years, we can cross check a lot of things that we with actual documents that we couldn't back when I started. It's an entirely different world in terms of history. We have the history of things related to the FBI, the CIA, Oswald himself that we didn't have back then. So I started going, did did these folks, I know they were sincere, I know they did the best with what they had available, did they get it right? And so I just sat aside and I said, I'm gonna due diligence, I'm going to look back at what I wrote and go, would I say the same thing now? And so I started work on something like, I thought it was going to be 50, 60 page monograph. Like, okay, checking out myself. I'll write it for myself. And what I found was I had made a lot of assumptions in my earlier books. There were things that I'd written that literally were not true, and now we know that they weren't true. And unfortunately, that pertains to a lot of the first and second generation literature, not because they were intentionally not true, that they didn't have access to the resources we do now. And that was after I found enough of that, I went, oh geez, I need to do this. I need to do it again right. I need to, as the title says, we need to revisit Oswald with what we know now and the sources we have now. For example, when Oswald was first being written about, no one knew his friends in Russia. No one knew what his friends thought about. Nobody had talked to them. What's their view of Oswald? Character, personality, political views. Nobody had talked to them. Over the years, I'd made friends with a couple of Marines. One of the Marines had actually been a counterintelligence officer at Atsugi. He showed up a few months after Oswald had left, but he was able to interview the Marines who had been around Oswald. He was able to get into a lot of the Marine records, interview the doctors who had treated Oswald uh, in Japan. And so there were sources that people really, including myself, hadn't been able to take into account. So that kind of kicked off the all right. It's going to move from a monograph to a book. Okay. And so I started working on the book. And then what really happened was the genesis of the book uh, comes from my friend Rex Bradford at the Mary Farrell Foundation. And I'm on the board of the foundation with Rex. And Rex volunteered to edit the book. And Rex is an obsessive editor. I mean, in terms of grammar usage, whatever. It's like your worst nightmare as an author is that's Rex. He will not let you get away with anything. And even as my wife would say, my punctuation tends to be creative. Like I like commas. I put them in a lot of places where they shouldn't be. Anyway, so Rex signed on to do that, and when he started doing it, he's also been in this JFK assassination thing for decades because he's the ultimate document geek, because he runs the Mary Farrell website and created it, got almost 2 million. I mean, he knows documents. So he's in a position to say, Larry, why didn't you mention this document? Or Larry, why didn't you explore this area? And my initial reaction is, geez, I wanted to avoid that, Rex, because it's really controversial and I don't know the answer. And he would not take that as an excuse. Again, another reason why he's the best and worst editor in the whole universe. It's like, no, you cannot avoid that. You have to deal with Mexico City. You have to deal with a backyard photo. You have to deal with New Orleans. And you have to understand it and give it the best explanation in terms of Oswald's character. Yeah, like, okay, fine, Rex. So the 50-page monograph ends up as a 400-page book. Okay. So a long-winded answer to your question, that's how I got from, oh, Larry, did you miss anything, to, oh, Lord, how big is this book?
Do you have like any real main points that you're trying to present with this book that you'd
Yeah.
like to get across?
Yeah, I think the big point is the Warren Commission did a huge disservice to Lee Harvey Oswald because they were literally given orders to fit him into a mold. I mean, in the book itself, we start out, David and I start out by presenting essentially why the Warren Commission report's positioning of Oswald is not trustworthy. Why they did what they chose to ignore. We look at some of the internal dialogue within the Warren Commission where staff members even had a problem with each other. We now know, which nobody knew decades ago, that there are internal memos saying we can't say this because we can't prove this, or we can't say this because if anybody ever reads our stuff, they'll know we made a mistake, or we're claiming more ground than we can claim. There was a lot of internal concern that was overridden that you don't see in the report itself. There's a lot of stuff in the 26 volumes that accompanied the report that was damning to the report. And that came out early on. I mean, skeptics, critics read it and went, "Hey, you guys forgot to mention this when you wrote the summary. Why is that?" So we know that it's not trustworthy. We also know that actually the Warren Commission was really, its positioning of Oswald was months after the fact. We often think, we, the critics of the Warren Commission, tend to blame this whole negative image of Oswald on them, but that's not true. The FBI leaked its own report within 2 weeks of the assassination, after an internal memo says we're going to have a real hard time writing a report saying that this guy is the lone assassin and there was nobody else involved. We're going to have a real hard, yet within 2 weeks, they got a final report and they leak it to the press. And from then on, with Oswald deceased, everything starts to leak from the FBI, from the Dallas police. So for 8 months, 6 to 8 months, the media is literally fed information. I won't even say it's just leaked. They can do whatever they want to, but the point is the stuff that gets leaked leads to a totally negative characterization of Lee Harvey Oswald in the public mind. Okay. So in response to the question, one of my goals was, okay, let's present a balanced view of Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald clearly was not antisocial. This is a guy with 2 kids. it's not like he never got along with women. He did. He dated lots of women. He proposed to different women. One of them eventually became his wife. He has a real social history background of his own that they tried to ignore because that doesn't fit with, they need a radical lone nut, not with no commitments, no ties, antisocial. That's what they needed because they couldn't find a motive. Uh, One of the grave difficulties with their report is they kept interviewing people who said, "Oh, Lee Oswald said good things about JFK. Lee Oswald liked what he was anti-racist. He kept he was very much in tune with the Kennedy administration policies, liked what Kennedy was doing on integration. He was a very big fan of social justice, racial justice. Why in the world would there be an issue with JFK? He's on the same agenda as JFK in that regard. True, he came back from the Soviet Union not liking the Soviet Union and not liking Russian communism. Okay, still on the same page. So why, the Warren Commission had a real problem there. So okay, one of the reasons to write the book is to present a balanced view of Oswald that the Warren Commission didn't. From a character, personality, background, not to cherry pick. Show both, good and bad. Yeah, he had character flaws. Everybody has character flaws. Did he have a problem with his wife? Not that unusual. That's did he like guns? Yeah. Okay. He's from the South. I grew up with half a dozen guns and still have them. That means nothing. Uh, Balance there. But on the other side, the conspiracy community, to some extent, in a reaction against the Warren Commission, wants to see him as either totally innocent, totally naive, totally uninvolved, just, taken advantage of after the fact, or someone who's actually totally different from what he claimed to be, who's essentially an intelligence asset who just takes one set of orders after another. So another reason for the book is to say, well, okay, let's look at his character and his personality and his behavior over, his life history. Does it match the Warren Commission? Yeah. Does it match those views of Oswald? No, doesn't match those either. So what is a balanced view of Lee Harvey Oswald up at the time of the assassination? So the goal of the book is to present a balanced view of Oswald from a historical, biographical standpoint. And about 60% of the book is that. Okay. The one place where Oswald's behavior does become anomalous, out of character, is on the day of the assassination. For example, Oswald is a reader. He's a TV news listener. He's actually a TV news freak. Everybody says he just stayed home, watched TV, watched the news, watched whatever. Okay, did a lot of that in conjunction with his reading. So why would he be following the news of the assassination? Why is he not watching TV like everybody else? Why is he not hanging around Dealey Plaza trying to figure out what happened? That would be Lee Harvey Oswald as we would know him, but that's not what he did. So how do you explain that? So the last third of the book or so explores an alternative scenario that explains that behavior totally disassociated from the assassination. No, he's not part of it, but what fits with his agenda? What can we investigate and determine that would be driving him to do those things without an involvement in the assassination? So there you go. Another long one. I don't give short answers. You can tell from that from already.
That's all right.
But that's what the book is trying to do. That's what the book does. Right, wrong, good, bad. That's what the book does.
Um, I would say, like, from my own experience, like I grew up Pentecostal and like Waco, Ruby Ridge, Oklahoma City, 9/11, all those things with the end times talk when you grew up kind of shapes your mind. He kind of took on a socialist view at a young age, though, right? In workers'
Absolutely.
rights and stuff like that.
the one consistent thing as far as his political view is he was always very much concerned with social justice, racial justice. His mother could never get or keep a job that wasn't very menial. You know, he couldn't get a job that wasn't very menial. He very he very much wrote and talked about this. It's not that he disliked capitalism entirely, but it's that he felt that there should be free education, there should be free medical care. You know, some of these basics should be available to everybody to kind of take the lid off. You know, if everybody can get an education, everybody, you know, has some level of hunger support, well, some type of social welfare, sure. He was definitely in that mode, and that's what interested him about Russia, because ostensibly Russia had that system, right? They'd had a revolution, had that system. So did it work? You know, what happens when you actually try to do that? Oswald's a guy who, you know, he's willing to put himself into the game. If he thinks that's what should, he's going to go see. Okay. And he went and see and to see, and he found out there's a real trade-off that they sacrificed a lot of their personal freedom. They couldn't travel. They couldn't do it. There were a lot of limits that they had traded for that social welfare, and he didn't like that. And he wrote it. I mean, I'm not making that up. He wrote it in 1963. He was writing about what he didn't like with their system, but what he was interested in is perhaps the revolution in Cuba had done a better job of it. So he became still with the same interest, but okay, how about the Cubans? How's Castro? They're making a lot of claims about this. I'd really like to go see how they're doing with it. But yeah, as a teenager, he actually wrote the Social Workers Party from Texas. Okay, it's got to be a great. That's like the one letter from Texas to the Socialist Workers Party. He goes, you know, I believe in socialism. I've been reading about this for some time now, a couple of years as a teenager, and I want to join your group. I want to support the cause. I'd like to join an organization. And if you don't have an organization for young people, how about if I start one? Would you endorse that? So he was on board with that agenda and that set of views before he went into the Marines. And when he got into the Marines, it's kind of like he was still talking that way. It wasn't that he gave it up. You know, he was here's a Marine talk, you know, essentially with populist, socialist views, interested in Russia, and he didn't hide it. The other Marines, you know, he would talk about it, and some of them that we kind of think of it, there were other Marines that had some of the same interest. It's not all or none. One of my Marine friends said, "Oh yeah, we had guys come into the service out of college, out of, you know, that would talk like that. You know, generally the guys they were bunking with were interested in, you know, the closest bar and the closest girls, you know. But even Oswald's Marine, one of his Marine commanders said Oswald was just different that way. Here's what most of the guys in his barracks were concerned with. Oswald's there reading, you know. That so none of that's particularly, you know, is very visible. None of it's hidden.
He he performed pretty good in the Marines, right? I mean, he wasn't like an outcast really or anything
I would
real
say
extreme punishment wise, right?
he went through basic training. Okay. Now, I mean, I went through basic training and saw lots of guys get put in, you know, with behavioral problems and not able to take orders and that sort of stuff. Okay. They're in that building over there and they eat separately from, you know, uh, a lot of, a number of guys don't even make it through basic training because it's very structured. You know, and you might think, well, Oswald is the opposite of basic structure. Well, when Oswald was doing what Oswald wanted to do, he took orders. It's just if it wasn't what he wanted to do, he didn't take orders well. So he gets through basic, fine. He goes through advanced infantry training, fine. He gets selected for Marine tech schools, and we're talking about pretty advanced Marine tech schools, including radar and you know, essentially air traffic control, traffic approach control, that sort of stuff. And he makes it through. He has no problem with any of that. Basic, advanced, tech school. he's fine coming out of that. And in his first assignment, he's fine. So, you know, for a period of time, he's doing fine in the Marines. It's only when he starts goes overseas, starts hitting the bars some, starts seeing girls some, starts seeing that thing happen too.
Right.
His social life changed dramatically once he got overseas, and okay, then he gets into in a bar with a exchanges words with a tech sergeant, and things go bad. Hey, that's the way it is. And but up until that point, the interesting thing is he his ratings were up and down in the Marines. Again, they were high, and then in Japan they dropped off, and he actually got busted. He was got busted, lost his stripe. He'd been scheduled for corporal, didn't get that. That was very upset because he'd even put in to extend his cure, and he didn't get that either. Okay, he gets sent back to the U.S., but for his last year in the Marines, his performance ratings were solid. He gets back to, I think, 4.5 and 5 out of a 5 rating scale. His radar work is solid. And to some extent, that's because Oswald, I think, had already made his mind, I'm done with this. He applies for college overseas, and so he's getting along. Oswald can get along for a certain period of time if Oswald wants to get along. Uh, he's not, he's not a one-dimensional character, and that's one of the things we really try to convey in the book is, he is situational, but then we're all situational. That in no way makes him unique.
uh he had ties with Cuba, or a group tied to Cuba that kind of got him on the FBI radar, right?
Yeah. Again, kind of situational. The first thing when Oswald came back from Russia, the FBI obviously interviewed him. I mean, they'd known about him. The State Department had provided information, so they interviewed him, and he was uncooperative at first. It's kind of like, this guy's got an attitude problem. Well, Oswald did have an attitude problem. That there's no doubt about that. But they do 2 or 3 interviews with him, and finally he not only agrees, he even agrees, like, okay, if somebody approaches me that you would consider to be subversive, I'll tell you about it. Okay, he agrees to that, and they keep him on a list, and they look at their sources in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He never tries to contact any socialist or communist, and so they take him off the list. But then about 6 months later, he starts writing to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which they are monitoring. They've got people inside looking at the mail coming into the FPCC headquarters. So they see he's corresponding. So headquarters goes, it's back on the list. We're interested in him again. But that's a headquarters thing. In New Orleans, Oswald, one of the things he does after a few weeks, he goes to New Orleans, gets a job, brings his wife and child down, has an apartment. Things are going well. He's got another manual job, which he's pretty bored with. He doesn't pay attention to that. He gets let go. And so at that point in time, he starts getting back into this, oh, I'm interested in Cuba. But for Oswald, it's never quite that simple. The first thing, he starts making contact with Cubans in New Orleans, but they're anti-Castro Cubans. At the same time, he's writing letters to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Okay, yeah, this is really into. So the anti-Castro Cubans come in contact with him. They're a little curious. They actually decide they contact their headquarters in Miami, and Miami says, well, check him out. He might be not what he says. So they try to determine, they actually send someone to call on him at his home, and is he really what he claims to be? And they hadn't fully made up their mind. But only after 2 or 3 weeks, they run into him out on the street, and he's leafleting in front of TV cameras for Cuba. It's like, oh, okay. Oh, that answered that question. So yeah, he definitely, one of the big things about the whole Oswald story in regard to the assassination is his agenda, which was an interest in Cuba, brought him to the attention of everybody from the FBI to the CIA. The group that he encountered was being run by the CIA for propaganda purposes primarily. And actually, by August of 1963, that group was already engaged in writing Congress people, in writing other groups, warning them about Oswald. Basically, even young Marines can be corrupted by this Cuban communist influence. So, we start dealing with several months where people know about Oswald. They're doing things about Oswald that he doesn't know about. He is totally unwitting in this thing that's developing around him. He's got his own agenda, right? I mean, it's fine, but the word we've coined to kind of describe this, David and I have, is the word entanglement. His activities have entangled him with the FBI, the CIA, the anti-Castro exiles, and so he's on a lot of people's radars. And for them, represents an opportunity. I mean, this is great propaganda. How can someone like, he's from the South, he's a Marine, how could he get corrupted like this? It becomes a great propaganda story. The interesting thing is that at the time of the assassination, a group had already been at work preparing a propaganda record with some of his statements from radio interviews and that sort of, pursuing that line of thought that they're going to use him as an example of Cuban influence and the evils of Cuban influence in the U.S. That thing was ready to go and was in the market within 2-3 weeks of the assassination. So Oswald, I don't think, had any idea. He's following his own interest, but he seems to have no idea that people could be using that for their own purposes.
Do you think he was a dangerous man, that if he wouldn't have been around, those kind of people would have done something anyway? Or do you think he was more kind of steered that direction?
Oh, I don't think he was dangerous in terms of the attack on JFK. Oswald, he was not a pacifist. I mean, Oswald's very outgoing. I'll give you an example. Oswald, he's in the Soviet Union working in a factory, and he stages a one-man strike. He refuses to work. You don't do that in the Soviet Union.
Right.
You don't do it as a Russian. You don't do it as American. It embarrasses his supervisor, who he's good friends with, personal friends with. Um, and some of the workers start to confront him and harass him, and he just walks around. It's just like Oswald being Oswald. He does what he wants to do, but not in really an aggressive, violent fashion. I mean, he certainly is one who would demonstrate. He's certainly one who would argue. He's certainly one who would speak his mind. He's George de Mohrenschildt described him as an activist. George was a friend of his in Dallas, and actually even de Mohrenschildt had berated him for spending too much time writing about what he believed in. It's kind of like he himself said, I told him, if he really believes in this kind of social and racial and economic justice, you don't just write about it, you get out and do something about it. You get out in the street, you demonstrate for it, you get public about it, which he did. So from that standpoint, yeah, from being violent, well, during the street leafleting, when the anti-Castro Cubans confront him, like, you were just down the street with us like 2 weeks ago telling us you were with us, and now you're with them. Oswald goes, well, yeah, that's right, but go ahead and slug me. Now hit me. That would be his way of making a point, of doing a demonstration, showing he's the one who's, logical and factual, and these guys are violent. Not him, them. They didn't, although he did end up in court for, disrupting the peace, as it were.
Do you think his wife wanted to go back to Russia, if I understand things correct, right? Do you think he would have ever considered that?
Oh, he he would have considered going back to Russia, but to some extent, I think that was probably a ploy. The real scenario is beginning at the first of the year in 63, his wife and he both started writing letters to the Russian embassy about her going back with the baby. And one of her letters says, you know, I'm a Russian citizen. I didn't renounce my citizenship. I want to come back because, it's implicit that she has having kind of problems with Oswald, but I can get a job on my own. Like he can't get a job and hold it, but I'm a pharmaceutical aide, and in Russia I could get a job. I can't get a job here. So she's pursuing that. In those same letters, it refers to the fact that Oswald might come, but that would be a separate question. Russia would have to consider that separately. And Oswald himself, especially when he's in Mexico, pitched it that he wanted to leave the U.S. He felt that he was being harassed by the FBI. He felt that he couldn't get a job, and he blamed them for a lot of that. He blamed the Marines for downgrading his classification, his discharge, to unsatisfactory. And so his pitch to the Russians in Mexico City was, look, my wife's going back to Russia with our child. Yeah, I'd like to go with her, but that's an issue I've got to pursue. What I need to do is go to Cuba while she gets there, and then I can pursue did he really expect to go to Cuba to Russia? My guess is no, he just wanted to get to Cuba. But they were both unsatisfied. I think it's pretty clear with the way things were working for them in the U.S. Oswald really thought when he came back from Russia, and if you think about it, it's sort of strange, really. He's got a personal experience in Russia at almost the height of the Cold War. He really should have been interviewed by a lot of people. The media kind of missed his message about why he didn't like communism, why the Soviet Union was not fulfilling it, why the Soviet Union he writes that the Soviet Union was using the Communist Party of these different countries as a tool. I mean, that's a great message. The problem is if you put him on camera, he would say that, but he would also say what they were doing right. And I think that's part of the problem. Oswald was kind of balanced himself, and you don't want to hear both sides of that story in 1962. You only want to hear one side. But when he went, he was actually invited to speak at a Jesuit college before he left New Orleans. And that's the kind of story he gave there. And we actually have letters in the book from the students thanking him for giving them a balanced picture of Russia. And I think that explains why the media wouldn't really have loved him, because that's not what you want to see. I was there. I saw it. You did not see that. Well, Russia is okay in some ways. No, you did not. That's not going to get past the editorial platform in a Dallas Fort Worth paper or an Oklahoma City paper. I guarantee.
What do you think he was thinking that day when it all transpired after?
Well, that's really what we get into in the last third of the book. We feel that he was being manipulated to some extent by anti-Castro Cubans who had connected with him in New Orleans, presenting themselves as Castro agents. And it's back to the definition of a scam. When you run a scam with people with their agenda, right? Not your agenda. If it's going to work, it's got to be, you want to help them. You want them to think you're helping them do what they want to do, right? Whether it's a Ponzi scheme or whatever. And we feel these guys were actually running a scam on Oswald to set him up initially, maybe just for propaganda purposes. But then people among that group, when we get to about October, Oswald is back in Dallas. He's got a job in the school book depository downtown. He becomes a target of opportunity in order to frame him as a Castro supporter and associate Castro with the assassination. So they actually, what we describe in the last third of the book is the way that they set him up to think that they were actually helping him pursue his agenda of getting to Cuba. So what do we conclude that on November 22nd, Oswald thought that these people were going to help him get out of Dallas, possibly with, the president's visit being a diversion, distraction, whatever. Everybody's thinking about the president. Nobody is looking at these little planes taking off from a Dallas airfield, where earlier in the week, an aircraft operator was approached by two people for a charter flight, long distance charter flight. What they were concerned with is how far can this plane fly? Can we get to, uh, you know, is it far? They don't say Cuba. He himself said, I was wondering if they were going to hijack my airplane and me, to get to Cuba, because that was going on at the time. Oswald himself had even talked about hijacking a plane as far back as New Orleans. Um, uh, and and actually had expressed that to Marina, and Marina had said, "You're an idiot." No, he wanted her to. No, I'm not going to be associated with that. Tell you what, if you get there, I'll bring the baby and come. But I'm not doing this. Marina's very, she was she bright lady. She's like, no, I'm not going to get sucked into that. Just like on the, it's not humorous at all, but the right before the assassination, he visited the Paynes and talked to her and said, well, I want to get an apartment right now. And basically she said, look, I just had a baby. I'm in a place that has all the appliances I need, including a washing machine. When you get when you get an apartment that's got a washing machine, I got two kids under 2 years old. Well, okay, we'll do it after. So she's very pragmatic as a young mother. It's like I ain't going into an apartment. You got. I'm going to have to check this out first. You've had me in too many dumps to begin with. You know, but this is a real world approach. This is a non you put things that they're saying in context of the real world, not conspiracies, for heaven's sakes. It's like, why did she turn him down? Because she wanted a washing machine. That's why she turned him down. You know, uh, at least that would be my guess. It's what she said, and I see no reason not to accept that. But for
Yeah.
your question, I think, Oswald, the anomalies that we see on November 22nd, we think are associated with these Cubans who have been, I won't say managing him because it wasn't that close. They've been scamming him basically. And they have him set up to think that something is going to happen that probably never was going to happen. They were going to kill him. I mean, he didn't know that. He may have quickly begun to suspect that. Okay, it's like, who can I trust? Is this really coming down like I thought it was? Um, but but his plan, I think he had an option. It's kind of like, these people have offered me a chance to get, and I want to go to Cuba. And by the way, when I went to Russia, I ended up in a factory. If I'm going to go to Cuba, I need to get a little more recognition. I don't want to end up in another factory. Hey, how great would it be as if I'm famous for hijacking an aircraft out of the U.S. to Cuba? They're going to pay attention to me. And especially if I just flew out of Dallas, I escaped, there's a lot of stories that you could play there. So I think he had that in his mind. And I think maybe it was a trade-off. Maybe if Marina had said, okay, next week we'll move, maybe he would have blown him off. We can't know that sort of thing.
Right.
But Oswald always looked at options. He was a thing. He was we I'm afraid the conspiracy community has viewed him as less smart than he was. I mean, he had tested an IQ of 118. The guy learned Russian. He didn't learn it extremely well. He even when he was Russia, he had people tutoring him in Russian. His friend was still practicing, but teaching yourself a foreign language by yourself well enough to even attempt a language test in the military, which he did on the Russian language. He is not when a Marine officer, and this is on record as testimony in the Warren Commission, the officer said, look, we in the barracks, we get into political dialogues. And Oswald was so well read and well spoken that he was talking to me on my level or better. This guy was a political science graduate from Yale. or Harvard, one of those schools. This is the officer, right? And he's going, he just was not your normal Marine. And he showed it. And he wasn't afraid to, he would just jump into a debate. But he'd been that way when he was a teenager in New Orleans. He was in an astronomy club. Friend took him home. They're going to talk astronomy, but Oswald starts talking politics and socialism, and the kid's father overhears this and said, "Are you a commie? You're a commie." And Oswald goes, "Well, I believe in some of the." And the dad kicks him out of the house. Right? Oswald's never bashful about saying what he believes. Which, by the way, unless you want to believe he was trained as a covert agent at the age of 7. This is just, again, Oswald's personality and character. A big thing about the book is to look at his personality, his character development, and look for continuity and consistency. That's the way history normally works, and we find that he from one point in time to another point in time, he behaves the same way, and until November 22nd. That's when the really anomaly kicks in, that he's not behaving. So something must be going on. But uh, but again, I think he had an agenda that was still in play on November 22nd, and somebody stole his agenda and used it for their own purposes, basically. But it wasn't stole his agenda and use it to kill the president, for heaven's sakes. It was stole his agenda to frame him, And really, when you think about it, all it took to frame him was to get a rifle that could be linked to him and put it at the crime scene, wherever it was. Could have been anywhere on Main Street. School book depository is great. He's got a job there. That's easy. But actually, it could have been anywhere where the crime was going to be committed, and that rifle does it. And even if Oswald had been out waving at the president, what do you think would happen? It's like, well, your rifles, who'd you give it to? You? He's in a conspiracy automatically. I'm saying you got no out. And when he starts to say, I have no idea how that got there, is anybody, as Oswald himself, the reason he gave for being arrested was, I've been in Russia and they're just trying to frame me because I've been in Russia, and you know what? That would have worked. It did, where it would have worked. I mean, you cannot, some of the things he said, about not liking America, not liking his, that he would have been in big trouble regardless. He like I say, people have always asked, well, what if he got in a cold that day? Doesn't matter, as long as you've got something that you can plant at the crime scene that links him to a Cuban. He's already linked to Cuba. He already did that himself. All you got to do is have that there, and he's in deep water. And the best part of it from the conspiracy standpoint is it's got him in a conspiracy. It's not just Oswald. It's Oswald and other people, which is why the lone nut story became so important, because you really can't have a Oswald connected to other people. That's the last thing that you want, because from a national security point, we know that everybody from the president's like, we do not want a conspiracy. Katzenbach writes a memo saying we've got it to the FBI, saying we've got to show him immediately as a lone attacker on the president. Now, what he doesn't say is, it's not in his memo. It's like, if we don't, things are going to go to hell, because we could end up in a war in any event.
Yeah. If there's one thing, I'm running short on time. I guess we went over a little bit longer than I said to you previously, but if there's one thing that you would want to leave in the listener's mind in the upcoming days before your book's released, what would that be?
The real message is that we've never had a balanced view of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I don't think that's fair for him. I don't think it's fair for history. I'm basically as an historical researcher, writer at heart, written lots of books on history, and I think we owe it ourselves to see the full picture and not have anybody present us with a biased picture, which in the case of Oswald, I think historically is what has happened. I had a friend recently who actually, he looked up the charter for the American History Association and what the ethics and goals they're supposed to commit to. And he started calling them up and said, well, I've seen what you've written about Oswald. Does this really comply with your ethical standard? And the answer generally was no. No, we didn't really, we wrote what everybody else wrote about him. So the one message is that I think in terms of fairness, after all this time, it's only fair to look at the full picture of Oswald. Then you can draw your own conclusions. That's why, as we talked a little earlier before the broadcast, the book is almost 400 pages long, but it has 433 endnotes, and almost all of those endnotes give you links to the primary documents. So you don't have to believe what David and I said. You read the source documents, look at the quotes, look at the statements, and make your own decision. But it's really only being fair for such a colossal event in history and to Oswald to make your own decision about it.
Well, Larry, I appreciate you coming on and taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk about your book. And there will be a link in the description, so hopefully people check it out.
All right. Well, I appreciate the time also, and have a happy new year.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
You bet.